Welcome to another Stellenbosch Business Institute LeaderSHIFT series. It is proudly brought to you by SBI, that is the Stellenbosch Business Institute. My name is Faith Mangope, and every single month it's an absolute honor and a privilege to host you. These are high-level, high-impact leadership series where we get to hear from thought leaders really across our globe of ours who are able to share insights regarding how is it that we can become better equipped to lead a very dynamic, a very uncertain sometimes, and also to exercise foresight in the way that we do it. This, of course, is brought to you by the Stellenbosch Business Institute. And not only that, of course, the SBI is known really for being the ones that are always hosting thought leaders and generously offer their times in providing trailblazing mechanisms in the realm of consulting pathways and executive learning processes that empower leaders to really navigate and just disrupt really the world around them, and also how to shape the future landscape. And this is exactly what we will be doing for 45 minutes, as always, every month. We will be hosting and hearing from our wonderful leaders who are then able to share some insights with us, also reflecting on their personal journeys and how they've had to show up as leaders within their respective fields. And of course, this morning, when I say this morning, it's afternoon my time, but she is joining me all the way from North Carolina. It is my absolute honor and privilege to have with you this afternoon or this morning. Also, we've got American CEO of CNEXT, Cheryl Stokes. Let me tell you a little bit about Cheryl as she joins us. So she is the CEO of CNEXT, which is a leadership development and executive networking company that helps connect, develop, and advance high-impact leaders. Now, before taking on her role as CEO, Cheryl was a partner at Heinrich & Struggles, where she helped launch the firm's diversity, equity, and inclusion practice, something that we're going to be talking about together as well today, and also looking at leading the leadership development practice and consulting also as part of the culture shaping practice. Before, of course, joining the organization, Cheryl helped found and then run a business for Duke University, Duke Corporate Education. I'm sure many of you have heard about it. She was the regional managing director for Duke CE's European operations, and under her leadership, the region enjoyed its strongest growth and profitability in Duke CE history. I know when I say this, I mean it, and not only that, I really believe this is true because you're definitely in good hands this morning or this afternoon. Cheryl, what an absolute honor and an absolute privilege to have you join us. And welcome to the Stellenbosch Business Institute Leadership Series.
Thank you so much, Faith. I am delighted to be here.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your background. Before we go into Cheryl, the CEO, let's speak a little bit about Cheryl, the human being, because a birdie told me that you have won 3 game shows. And not only that, of course, you are the person that we never take on when it comes to a game of Scrabble. So you are somebody who's very well astute. In fact, if I want to bet money on a game, it is you that I'm taking on with me. Just talk to us a little bit about your background, Cheryl, family and the like, and of course, the journey to getting to where you are today.
Thank you so much. And yes, the birdie told you something, although I didn't win all 3. So I'll share that story momentarily. I am a wife, a mother of teenage children, and enjoy my life in North Carolina. I'm originally from Flint, Michigan. So many of you may have heard of that town because it's the birthplace of General Motors. It had a huge water crisis, which is still ongoing. And I share that to share that I come from a working class background. My father was an assembly worker in the General Motors plants, and my mother was a beautician. She did hair. And they instilled in me the importance of education. I was good in school. I ended up working as an engineer, going to school at General Motors Institute, working for GM, and then working in the aluminum industry, ultimately doing graduate work, led me to the Coca-Cola company, where I enjoyed working with folks globally. And really, in that trajectory that led to then Duke and Hydrick and where I am now, what came clear to me is leadership is so incredibly important. And so for me personally, I have a passion for exceptional leadership because I've seen the difference that leaders make in the lives of the people that they lead in their businesses, but in the world and society more broadly. And so I truly believe my own purpose is to help equip exceptional leaders. And so the work that I've done over the last years have allowed me to contribute to the greater good in that way. So that's a bit about sort of me and why I do what I do. Now, the game show thing, I was sharing with Faith earlier that I'm a game show fanatic. I mean, I was born, I think, just loving game shows. I don't know why. But I have been on 3 game shows here in the US. One of them, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, when my son was born. It's how I financed my maternity leave because I won $50,000. I was on the Wheel of Fortune, which is kind of the icon of every game show that we want to be on in this country. And I was fortunate enough to win that one as well. The last one I went on didn't go as well. It was The Chase, and there were all of the Jeopardy champions. So really smart trivia folks, and our team did not win that one. So, but I think, the fact that I love game shows sort of speaks to my mindset, which is anyone can win. Why not me? That's kind of a life philosophy I have.
That is a beautiful life philosophy. Anyone can win. Why not me? Cheryl, especially when it comes to this issue around diversity, inclusion, and equity. To be honest with you, they just seem to be sometimes buzzwords, sometimes words that make us more popular or drive a conversation around the coffee or the dinner table, whichever way you want to see it. But how many of us actually understand what it actually means when we're talking about diversity, when we're talking about inclusion and equity? What exactly do we mean by it?
Yeah, thank you for that. And being an engineer by training, it sort of works into an equation that I will share with you that I've used over the years. The first thing is diversity. It is a fact. Everyone is diverse. It is all of our individual differences, our identities, the things that make us unique. And oftentimes people look at diversity and they only see what's on the surface, right? They see a woman, they see a Black woman, they see, an Asian male, whatever. But if you think about an iceberg and the fact that most of the iceberg is under the water, that's true of us and our identities. The things we see absolutely contribute to who we are, but I'm a mother. I introduced myself that way. I care very deeply about things that a mother would care about. I'm in a sorority, a historically Black Greek letter organization in the United States, globally, that influences how I engage in society. I'm deeply religious, and so my faith is important to me. All of these make up my identity, and I like to say that inclusion includes white males as well. So I want to dispel the notion that diversity only means people of color, women. It could be neurodiversity. So that's the first part of that equation: diversity. Everyone has a diversity story. The second part is diversity is a fact, but inclusion is an act. And inclusion is the intentional practice that you have as a person to open doors and allow others to contribute, to provide a platform where people can share their ideas, their thinking, their concerns, to listen respectfully and engage with them in a way that shows their contribution is valued, and they have something to bring to the table. So as leaders, managers, being an inclusive leader, as far as I'm concerned, it's just table stakes for good leadership. All leaders need to be inclusive leaders because we can't know everything ourselves. We have to engage those around us to come up with the best solutions, to get the best data analysis, to engage in the best way with our customers. And so inclusion is intentional action. So diversity plus inclusion, when you have those two things, you actually get belonging. Now, I don't know how much they're talking about that in South Africa, but that's sort of the new buzzword here, right? Belonging. What it means is I feel like I belong in a community, in an area, a space. I am welcomed. I'm part of something bigger than myself. And organizations want belonging because that leads to engagement. And there's a lot of analysis and data that shows you that engaged employee populations take less sick days, are more productive, have better ideas, have a better experience. And so there's a real business reason for diversity plus inclusion leading to belonging, which gets you more engagement. Because at the end of the day, in business, we want great results. And you need engaged employees who are free to show up as their true selves and contribute in a way that delivers value for themselves and the organization.
Sure. As you're speaking about that, and before I go to my next question, I'd also just to welcome our guests. I do see some of you are still entering this particular meeting. May I just request that if you do have a question, would you just type it on the chat box, and then we'll field those questions. Let's keep it as interactive as possible. So if you do have a question or anything pops up, please just type it up, and then I will also pose that question to Cheryl. So we'll keep it as lively as possible. And please do not hold back. The only way that we're going to learn from each other is if we're truly authentic. in this particular conversation. And speaking of which, and authenticity, Cheryl, the truth is leaders are people. People are coming from communities, they're coming from families, they're coming from backgrounds with certain views and perspectives. And sometimes those views and perspectives are shaped by, biased prejudice, shaped by the type or the era of the time. I'm going to make a very typical example. We're in South Africa, and in South Africa, we come from apartheid, right? We come from colonialism. We also come from apartheid. And if you grew up in a family that had a certain belief about a certain group of people, you can be a leader, but that leader still holds certain ideas and perceptions that were ingrained in them during childbirth, during growing time, during school time. And that in itself, when that leader gets into positions of power, some of us who have not actualized enough take on those prejudices, take on those bias with us into the workplace, into the organizations, into spaces of even leadership, political leadership. So how then do you start achieving diversity, which is a fact, and inclusion, which is an act, if we're still dealing with our backgrounds, our belief systems, our ideologies, which are entrenched in the way that we were raised?
Yeah, it's a great question, and absolutely everyone carries biases. It's the way we're wired as people, right? Our brains can't handle all the data in the world, so we have to make conclusions. And to your point, our family context, our societal context gives us certain beliefs that we might hold to be truth, right?
Mhm.
But as a leader, you have to be aware that the the lenses that you carry are not necessarily true. You have to recognize that you may see things one way, another person may see the same thing in a totally different way, given their experience. The way that I believe that we can become aware of these unconscious biases and we can begin to work on changing them is by having something that I'll quote someone, Brian Stevenson. I'll tell about him in a minute, but he talks about this notion of empathy in proximity. Empathy and proximity. What it means is you have to get close in this context to people who are not like you and understand as best you can their experience, to recognize when your ideas about that group, that organization, that those people are not the reality. And you can only do that through empathy. So Brian Stevenson is the founder, he's a lawyer. There was actually a movie made about him called Just Mercy, a very popular movie in the US some years ago. But he's the founder of an organization called the Equal Justice Institute. And what they do is advocate for people who've been jailed and in the prison system in the United States, the industrial prison system, which is a whole nother story we could talk about, the criminalization of people of color, because that is something that is documented that has happened in this country. But Brian's organization works to exonerate people who have been unjustly locked up. And this idea of empathy in proximity is what he uses as a lawyer to help juries understand that when a certain person was on trial, there was no one who understood their experience. There was no one who necessarily, as you said, that there are people who may have come from backgrounds where they had assumptions about this person and they didn't see the human being and their particular situation. What they saw was a stereotype. So I'm a huge believer of building connections, empathy, getting to know people as people and not labels as the first way to break through the biases that we have. But as leaders, we have a responsibility to recognize that we don't know everything, we can't know everything, we carry lenses into a situation that are not correct, are not always correct, are not always appropriate. And we have to be willing to open up and learn. Learning and the work that we do in terms of helping leaders develop and learn that Stellenbosch does, it's incredibly important. If you are not always learning as a leader, and if you're not open to learning, you will fail. You will absolutely fail.
But how does a leader recognize that they are not being inclusive? that they're not being considerate, that they're not being diverse, conscious of the diversity within the organizations? How do I self-regulate and self-lead so I recognize even my own shadows?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the first thing is you have to be open to feedback and solicit feedback and get feedback. There are many ways to do that. We talk about mentoring. I had an opportunity younger in my younger career days to be a reverse mentor for a very senior leader. And it was because he recognized I don't understand the experience of women of color in our organization. And I really want to make sure I'm saying things that are appropriate. So I would literally tell them, when you said that, here's how it hit me. It hit me that, you meant that only men could do this job. And you should think about saying it this way. But a leader has to be open to hearing truth from someone and be willing to change if in fact that truth shows that you have something in you that could need to shift. So you can get feedback through mentoring relationships, reverse mentoring relationships. Many organizations have leadership tools, 360-degree feedback. I would say in organizations where you're using leadership tools and there's 360 feedback and you have values that you have stated as an organization, oftentimes inclusion is one of the values. There should be behavioral prompts in those assessments that help people give the feedback of, does this person routinely reach out to others in the organization who may come from underrepresented backgrounds? Does this person solicit feedback? Does this person incorporate time in meetings for everyone to speak? So there's that sort of thing. On the flip side, I will say that oftentimes it takes courage from the people around that leader to point out what they may not see, because you just don't see it. If you're a fish in the water, you don't see the water around you. So you need someone who is courageous, who can speak to you about what they see. It is fantastic when there are allies, people who maybe share the same identity as the leader, maybe they are connected. And so the leader will respect that person's point of view. And if that person is an ally, then they can give feedback in a way that, shifts the burden away from someone from, say, an underrepresented group of having to speak truth to power. But I do believe it takes courage and the willingness of people to speak truth to power. It takes allyship. It takes self-awareness and being intentional about seeking that feedback and learning, growing, and changing as a leader to ultimately make shifts that will help you become more empathetic, that will help you become more inclusive.
What role can young people play in organizations and civic societies to perhaps be a catalyst for that empathy, for that consciousness, for that vulnerability that gets displayed in having to include people? I often find that young people are the ones that are perhaps more, and I don't know if it's the buzzword too, the woke generation. They are the generation that understand the plights of the LGBTQIA plus community. When we're talking about diversity and inclusion, we're not talking about black and white. We're talking here about also the LGBTQIA plus, and sometimes we leave that conversation at the door. And a lot of times it also requires, us being conscious that there may be a 21-year-old who's got a different perspective and perhaps a more worldlier perspective than what we may have at the age of 50 plus or 60 plus or 45 plus. But just talk to us a little bit about the role of young people, because I often find in organizations, some organizations, of course, as they're becoming younger, the youth voice is heard, but other organizations that are perhaps more traditional and often larger, the youth voice is the one that must grow up for about 20 more years before they can even contribute anything to the table.
Absolutely. The most successful leaders and organizations understand that there's a true asset in youth. Youth bring innovation, youth bring different ideas, and quite frankly, Generation Z, I think that's who comes after millennials, right? You've got your
Generation
boomers,
Z and then Alpha.
Millennials, Z, and then Alpha. Z and Alpha, they expect inclusion. they expect a voice, a seat at the table. Now, there's always got to be some balance, right? They can't come in and immediately be on the board of directors. However, organizations who are successful are finding ways to actively engage those younger generations because they represent the talent pool, they represent the customer profile, they represent demographics in the marketplace that are incredibly important to businesses. So why wouldn't you use the inherent talent that you have to understand and better engage? You can, as a leader and as a business, there are things you can do, such as something we did in my business. We formed what we called an advisory council, where we took some of our younger talent who had ideas about things in the business, things they thought we could do better. And we basically made them a group of internal consultants and gave them a strategic business challenge and said, you go away, work on this. We're going to let you devote certain amount of time. We're going to give you an advisor, a senior leader who you can bounce questions off of, and ultimately bring your recommendations back to me, to our executive leadership, so we can improve and we can know, what ideas you have and what things you see, because you're working at a level that I'm not, right? And I think that model of having sort of internal consultancies, if you will, advisory councils. Another thing I'm very big on are employee resource groups or business resource groups, ERGs, BRGs, that often are aligned by affinity. In the States, many times they'll say it's for women, it's for people of color, it's Black people, it's for LGBTQ plus, IA, it's for veterans. There's a generational opportunity where perhaps it's for millennials or Gen Z or Alpha, where again, they find community, they can be a resource to the organization. There's specific development opportunities that you can give those organizations. So I'm a huge fan of engaging youth in ways that helps them learn and grow, helps them contribute, and helps the organization succeed and keeps the talent engaged. Because at the end of the day, I'm Generation X. We showed up with an expectation. You have a job, you do your job. Where I'm from, people used to work for 30 years for GM before they retired, or 40 years. Well, that doesn't exist. We know, this generation will have 11, 12 career opportunities along the way. And so the hope is that for the time you have millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha in your workforce, that they can contribute, learn, and grow, that you get the benefit of their contributions, the innovations they bring to the table. And if they do leave, when they do leave, that it's a positive experience because they may come back. They're also sort of net promoters. If you think about a net promoter score, you want this generation saying positive things about your organization. So ultimately, you can attract more talent because the need for great talent will always exist.
I've got a comment here, and please do stop sending through your questions, and you can be as open as you want. Or maybe you're quite curious about how is it that diversity can be and inclusion can be more or can be best implemented and more effectively an effective way in your organization. Please just do send through your questions on the chat box, and then we'll be able to field those questions. But I do have a comment here from someone. It says JW saying leaders need opportunities to develop self-awareness and to embrace their own vulnerabilities in recognizing unconscious bias. They need to develop self-awareness and need opportunities to develop self-awareness. And I love this comment by JW. But then the question then becomes, Cheryl, are there spaces and tools that leaders can apply so that they can indeed, as you're saying, recognize their own unconscious bias, deal with some of those shadows from their upbringings and the like? I mean, where do we go in a practical way? Where do we go? What tools do we put at our disposals, and do we have at our disposal to allow us to become more aware?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm actually looking up to make sure I say the name of the tool right. So many people have taken the Harvard Implicit Association Test, the IAT. If you Google it, you can find it, you can take it, and it helps you sort of understand some of the lenses that you work through. So there are tools like that that are assessments validated by organizations like Harvard and other groups. As I mentioned before, the internal leadership assessments, 360-degree tools that your human resources groups might apply. Oftentimes, there's opportunities to integrate questions there that will give data to leaders so that they can then see the things that they need to work on. There's coaching. I'm a huge fan of executive coaching, and coaches in this space in particular, helping leaders become more inclusive, become aware of their own biases, to be more impactful as a leader. There's a whole set of coaches who do that sort of work. There are many resources now online that you can find. There's reading, there are podcasts. You have to, as a leader and as a learner, you have to take the initiative to find things for yourself, right? And it has to be intentional, meaning you make time for it and you seek it out versus waiting on HR or someone to do it to you. You have to be open and want to pursue a path of learning yourself. But those are just some of the things, the tools that I would think. And then, of course, there are leadership development programs in the space where we work, where a big part of it is about helping leaders gain self-awareness and develop goals where they can enhance their leadership and shift behaviors. And so you might have a program that includes assessments and coaching and subject matter experts who bring this topical information to bear. And those are some of the things I would say.
Sure. You know, in often cases, we never speak about the consequences of not applying diversity, inclusion, and equity. And a lot of us don't know. A lot of us feel, but it's not. It's that kind of, you know, concept in the boardroom or in the organization that has got a minimal budget. Let's tick a box and say that we've done it and hand it over to HR so that it can go within our ratings of an organization and not really pay much mind to it. But if you had to table the consequences of not being diverse, of not being inclusive, what are those consequences in organizations? I mean, you can even look at social standings as well. What is the long-term impact of such?
Long-term impact, less good business results, because at the end of the day, as you know, I'm a Black woman in America. I want social justice. I want the moral imperative, but that's not why businesses work in the DEI space. Businesses work in the DEI space because decades of research has shown more diverse and more inclusive organizations outperform their competitors in the marketplace in terms of financial results, better quality decision-making, more innovation. You can look, McKinsey, BCG, PwC, Accenture, all these organizations, the World Economic Forum, they publish research year after year where they have studied the results of global organizations, and those who have more diversity on their boards, in their leadership, in their organization, outperform their competitors. So that's the hard fact. Now, if you think about the world and just the way that demographics are shifting and the generations are evolving, this is a matter of business sustainability. If you are not able to have an inclusive environment where everyone can come to the table and contribute, and you have a very homogenous culture and you know your leadership is homogenous, you will ultimately fade away because the world is changing and you have to be able to engage. Oh, I hear questions, or do I hear a question or a commentary?
There will be, they'll just, I will just mute there. I think I see one of our guests. They'll be muted in just a second. But, you know, as you're speaking about how the world is changing, sometimes the world changes so fast that, especially as leaders, we have to play catch up most of the time. And in that changing world, we have to exercise an element of foresight and an element of vision.
Yes.
So how then do we start visualizing a future? Maybe you can bring us into confidence as well, based on what the conversations are looking like in terms of the next 5 years or 10 years, where organizations and diversity and inclusion is concerned, where countries and diversion and inclusion is concerned, and how we see that materializing and manifesting within these spaces of the organization. I mean, what does the world look like from a diversity and inclusion perspective in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years for that matter?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm certainly not a futurist, but I know a few and I like to read their work. So, I will say, as far as trends, we know women are a growing portion of every population in the world. And one consistent aspect of DEI around the world is the engagement and advancement of women. And there's much work in the not-for-profit sector that shows that when you invest in women and girls, you actually raise the standard of living and you raise the sort of the positive outcomes for entire communities. And that is because in many societies, I won't say all, women are the nurturers, the caregivers, the core of a family. And so that's why global not-for-profits often focus on the education of girls and women, et cetera. Well, there's a parallel in business, right? Where as there are more and more women who are available as talent, who are in the workforce, those women bring a leadership style, a unique perspective and experience that greatly benefits organizations. I recently contributed to an anthology of women's stories in honor of International Women's Day. And I cite a piece of research in this chapter. It's from a group called the Leadership Circle. And it was written about in, I think, Forbes. And basically, the Leadership Circle does leadership assessments, thousands of people around the world. And they did an analysis. And on every metric of leadership, women were at the top. What does that mean? It means women are great leaders, inherently great leaders. Now, often the opportunities aren't placed before women. We are slow to raise our hands. There's this whole dynamic where we sometimes feel if we don't have 110% of whatever the checklist is of the things for a position, then we won't apply. So there's some encouragement that women often need to take a risk, to raise your hand and to engage. But on the whole, women, and that trend globally, I don't see reversing. So in the next 5-10 years, there'll be even more women as college graduates and in the trades, et cetera. So that talent pool is there. Youth, what we were talking about earlier. If you look at demographics around the world, the population in that millennial, Gen Z, Gen Alpha is growing in many societies. And those societies where you don't have that growing population, there's sort of the and I want to use the right word for it, but you see the slowing, and you see less innovation, you see less economic growth. You can look at countries where they've had policies of limiting births, et cetera. Well, they're now suffering. They're now trying to encourage more births because you need that population to come behind in order to lead businesses. Complexity. You mentioned earlier, and I certainly experience this, and I'm sure the people on this call do. It is incredibly challenging to be a leader today. There's so much volatility in the world. People have talked about that acronym VUCA for years: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. Well, it's to the power of 10 these days, and that's not stopping. That's not changing. In fact, it's getting more and more. And I will borrow a very, I think, impactful framework I'll share from my days at Heidrick and Struggles. They have a framework for leadership called META. Great leaders are able to mobilize, execute, and transform with agility. Mobilizing is about inspiring people. It's the purpose-driven leadership. It's getting people to work, engaging multiple stakeholders. Executing is about getting things done, following things operational, getting the results. Transforming is, we got to run the current business, but we need to now shape what the future business is going to be. The analogy that people often use are things like, we've got to fly the plane and turn it into a jet while we're flying the plane. So you got to transform, but you got to keep the business going. Where I want to really double click is this idea of agility. So because agility is the differentiator from all of Heidrick's research, and you can go to their website, you can read many things that they've written about Meta. And agility is a key differentiator. They define agility as learning. So we've been talking about leaders and our need to learn. Great leaders learn. Foresight, what you have mentioned. Leaders need to think about the implications of things in the future, be able to sort of think around the corner, do scenario planning, to really consider how future trends might impact the business currently and to prepare for that. So it's learning, foresight, resilience. You have to be resilient as a leader. Things come at you all the time. You've got to be able to get back up. And then finally, adaptability. You've got to be able to pivot at the right times and the right ways and understand when other moves are there. So I highly recommend checking out the resources that Heidrick and Struggles has, because there's a lot of IP that they have out in the marketplace that can help leaders. And there are assessments and things related to that I think are very powerful.
I've got another question for you. It's coming in, is it Oryx Swakboy this morning, saying, please explain whether companies which embrace diversity are generally more profitable, and I think you touched on it a little bit earlier, or sustainable. What is the best way to measure the impact of diversity and management thereof within a company? What is the best way to measure the impact? I love that question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think to the first part of the question, it's both. So financial results, they're more profitable and they are more sustainable, to the point of, as the world continues shifting, it's a matter of business sustainability. You're able to ensure the continued successful operations of your business when you have a talent pool that will continue to be able to lead and grow the business. So that first part of the business, yes and yes, is how I would answer it. To the point of measuring the impact, you said earlier, sometimes people will make DEI a check the box activity, right? They'll hand it off to HR or some group and they look at it on a very surface level. Those efforts tend to fail. Why? Because they're disconnected from the strategy. So my deep belief is that executive leadership has to own and have accountability for inclusion, for DEI, and it has to be integral to your business. It is a strategic business initiative, just like, I don't know, digital transformation may be a strategic business initiative. And when you have something that is a strategic business initiative, there's budget, there's governance, there's accountability. And so this idea of how do you measure, you have to have goals, and it has to be tied to what your business wants to strategically accomplish. If you can't explain how diversity and inclusion supports the direction of the business, then that's a place to start, number one. Number two, as I mentioned, as a strategic business initiative has governance, there's some goals that you have. There should be goals. If you look at your HR data and the talent that you have, and you find that there are imbalances and representation in certain communities, well, then you need to have initiatives that help you close those gaps, because ultimately you won't have the talent that you need to run the business successfully. But it's not about quotas. It's not about, oh, we need to be sure we've got X number of Black women because that's the thing to do. It is about, does our talent pool reflect the society in which we operate? Will we be able to continue getting the best and brightest talent in that society? And do we not just get them, but is everyone having the opportunity to progress through the organization and having the support around them that helps them navigate their career path, so that ultimately we have the robust and diverse leadership that we need to grow the business?
Sure. And I think more than anything else, and I just saw another kind of, the question that you're raising as well, do our organizations reflect society at large? And how important it is. And And perhaps we can also zero in as well, Cheryl, in if we answer that question, do our organizations reflect society at large? It starts with us having the uncomfortable conversations, the vulnerable conversations, the not so PC conversations, in a respectful way, of course, but the not so PC conversations, so that we can better understand our respective backgrounds. But how are we faring, really, if we look at the way in which organizations are being run globally, in getting into the element of discomfort to achieve that element of empathy?
Yeah, it does vary. And, we were chatting a bit earlier, in the US, DEI is really under attack. And there are different political agendas and motivations behind it. But what's happening is people aren't having the uncomfortable conversation about the impact of systemic racism, about the impact of sort of organic talent systems. When organizations don't have good talent development systems and talent strategies that allow you to get data, that allow you to track progress, that allow you to offer opportunities to everyone, then what can happen is things like promotion and advancement um, become a tool of, who do I know that I want to put into a role, versus there being a broad consideration of who has the capability and opening the door so that many people can have the opportunity. So, there's work that many organizations need to do in order to ensure that they've got the talent management processes and systems in place that allow you to take the bias out of your systems. But again, at the end of the day, in a society as in the States now, and what's happening with DEI, what I see are kind of two extremes, which is fascinating. So on the one hand, there are organizations who made a lot of commitments after George Floyd was murdered in 2020, and the world was, just shocked and horrified. And so there was a call for change. And, to that point I made earlier, empathy and proximity, the world got some empathy because we were all very proximate, because we were at home during COVID and we saw George Floyd get murdered. And that had a huge impact. So that caused corporations to make all kinds of promises. Now, what happened is many organizations did that out of emotion without thinking about the why and the how it connects to their business. And so if you just had an emotional reaction and you made promises because you felt sorry for someone, but you didn't understand the impact of why diversity and inclusion could help your business, then it's easy to backpedal when there's pressure. And that's what's happening on the one end of the spectrum. On the other end, I've been overjoyed in the work that I do, and CNEXT has a network of CEOs who act as educators in our programming. And I talk with many of them. We've got an advisory board of iconic CEOs, and they tell me in their meetings and boards, they are doubling down because they understand the strategic importance of diversity and inclusion.
Sure.
And so there's kind of that two ends of the spectrum that's happening in the States. And I don't think we're alone. I think globally you see similar pendulums where on the one hand, there's kind of political rhetoric and, attacks. And so people are backpedaling, but then you have those organizations who really get it. And so they are doubling down. But the key is ensuring that you've got the data so that you're not just doing things in a vacuum or because it feels good, but that you understand what benefit you will get by closing these gaps. And that data ties back to the point that someone asked about metrics. So certainly data and analytics, particularly in the HR function, play a huge role in being able to measure progress and outcomes. And so, I encourage in this environment of sometimes contention, grounding yourself in where your business is today, where you want to go, the data around your talent, and how that talent is progressing, and addressing where you see gaps, where you see roadblocks, where you see things that aren't working well.
I'm going to try my best to steal literally about 30 seconds from this conversation, because I see the time and the clock is not on our side, but the questions are coming in so much. that I have to ask you. So I've got one question coming in from Jamila saying, so what do you do if you work with a woman in a leadership role who asks ideas but tends to dismiss it and only uses her ideas or people in her circle, not other fresh ideas? How does one overcome this frustration? Maybe in 30 seconds or so.
Yeah, that can be incredibly frustrating. I would say find an ally. First of all, try to give the feedback yourself if you have the relationship and you're comfortable, because that courage piece. If you can't give the feedback or if she's not open to it, try to find an ally who might be a peer on the same level as that woman to observe and to give the feedback, suggesting that there be documentation of ideas that you keep as records for your team in order to have a bank to pull from in the future, could also shed light on the ideas that are moving forward versus what stays in the team. So those are kind of three things I would say quickly, because I know we are very close to time.
We're very close to time. They often say that time actually goes very fast when you're having fun. So much appreciated. Cheryl, it really has been an honor and a privilege to host you this morning for your time and, of course, afternoon for others as well. And I do thank you for just sharing some spaces and having these very real conversations about how to show up as leaders, particularly in this forever changing world, and how do we stop making diversity, inclusion, and equity something that is practical and practice instead of something that becomes abstract and often left on the shelf. So really do thank you for your insights. And I know it's going to be the last time that we call upon you.
Thank you so much, Faith. It's been a privilege and a pleasure, and I really appreciate the opportunity to engage with your audience, and hopefully it's been helpful.
It definitely has been. Now, this is where we leave it for this edition for the Leadership Series. Please do not go away too quickly, because let me tell you something. We've got on the in April, we've got another series coming up with our thought leader, Lewis Funrain, and we'll be conversing really on the topic of sense making as a key enabler for collaboration. Sense making as a key enabler for collaboration. Don't forget that this particular recording will be available on the SBI website shortly. And of course, you get to engage with the conversations that we've had today. Thank you so much for being with us once again. Thank you so much for showing up as leaders, and continue to do so in the spaces that you occupy. Until we talk again, good night and God bless.